Welcome to Gospel Perspectives on World History, and I'm your host, Michael Stone. Thank you for joining us as we begin looking at the secular history of the world through the lens of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. While this podcast is primarily geared towards members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, anyone who has an interest in topics of faith and history are welcome to join us. And as an important legal notice, while I do intend to center what I share as much as possible on the verified details of the historical record and on ancient and modern scripture as approved by the Church, I do want to stress that the views I share here do not necessarily represent official doctrine, policy, or the views of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that I take full responsibility for the content and programming of this podcast. So, last time we discussed the Neolithic Revolution and how the earliest civilizations in general formed. But today we're going to look at the first specific major civilization that we know of that emerged around 8,000 years BC in ancient Mesopotamia. Now, if you are expecting me to give you a comprehensive account of Mesopotamian history, I am going to disappoint you. This group of peoples who lived in what we call the Fertile Crescent, that is the modern-day regions in Iran, Iraq, and Syria, this group of people, they have a roughly 6,000-year history. And so what I can do in a 20-ish minute episode is give you an overview, highlighting primarily three key periods of Mesopotamian history and just briefly touching on some of their key accomplishments. So to begin, the term Mesopotamia literally means land between the rivers. And so, as is the case for all major early civilizations, Mesopotamian civilization settled along the banks of a major river, in this case, two, the Tigris and the Euphrates. So knowing their names isn't as important, however, as knowing their impact on Mesopotamian life. So first, these rivers became a critical avenue for trade. Thanks in large part to these rivers, not only were different Mesopotamian cities like Uruk and Sumer able to trade with each other, but they were also able to trade with farther off locales like India, the Harappan civilization in specific, which we will talk about in another episode. Not only does this help their economy, but it also enables what a lot of historians get very excited about. It's this phenomenon called cultural diffusion. It's not just goods and precious metals being exchanged. Everything from language, technological stuff, and artistic innovations as well get exchanged. Beyond this, people and the diseases they carry are also conveyed through this early natural highway system as well. And so this leads to some major impacts for the daily lives of these people. Secondly, these rivers provided a critical source of irrigation. Systematic agriculture thrives best with reliability. And having a reliable source of water in the right amounts at the right times is vital. Unfortunately, for the Mesopotamians, the Tigris and Euphrates have the same predictability you'd expect from a toddler who found the Halloween candy a few months early, ate all the pixie sticks, downed your Red Bull, and then was administered a triple dose of NyQuil from the new babysitter in the hopes you wouldn't find out. So, in case that extended simile was lost on you, my meaning is this. Those rivers were completely unpredictable. Sure, a good portion of the time you could expect a decent flow, but in a bad year you could have the rivers dry up, or what was more common, you could have them completely flood over and destroy your crops. To their credit, Mesopotamians did try to mitigate these issues with levees and other preventative measures to prevent too much flood damage, but when there's too much water, there's just simply too much water, and there isn't that much you can do. What I find fascinating is the impact that this kind of chaotic environment had on the Mesopotamians. When water is the lifeblood of your civilization and governs so much of how each individual's life goes, these kinds of things ultimately do have a powerful effect on a culture's way of looking at deity. So as their natural world seemed capricious, untrustworthy, powerful, and dangerous, so too were the Mesopotamian gods. In their myths, the gods were seen as forces to keep appeased lest they get upset and send a flood to wreak havoc. offering prayers, living honestly, and building massive ornate temples. These were all things meant to hedge your bets to help keep the gods happy. Unfortunately, even then, it was still a game of chance. One Mesopotamian myth even recounts how one of these gods just simply got annoyed with all the noise humans were making, and so he decided to flood the earth so he could get some sleep. Could you imagine if I as a parent did that with my kids? Go to sleep, you little cretins, or you'll sleep with the fishes! Speaking of water here, reflect for a moment on your, or maybe even your family's, scripture study habits. Studying the scriptures is the lifeblood of our spiritual health. Fortunately, we get to control how much of it we get. If our scripture study habits of studying the source of the living waters are infrequent, unpredictable, or even perhaps something we feel the church is responsible for, and so we only get that on Sundays, our spiritual intake valve of those living waters will often run dry. And even the occasional burst or marathon of intense scripture study, if not followed up with an applied, conscious effort to make it a habit, may lead some to falsely think that they've stocked up on the scriptures and that they'll be good for the next few months or years. Is not such an attitude as spiritually destructive as these rivers were anciently? So no, I believe that what Elder Bednar taught about these habits in 2009 is especially true. And I quote, "Each family prayer, each episode of family scripture study, and each family home evening is a brushstroke on the canvas of our souls. No one event may appear to be very impressive or memorable. But just as the yellow and gold and brown strokes of paint complement each other and produce an impressive masterpiece, so our consistency in doing seemingly small things can lead to significant spiritual results. Wherefore, be not weary in well-doing, for ye are laying the foundation of a great work. And out of small things proceedeth that which is great." Consistency is a key principle as we lay the foundation of a great work in our individual lives and as we become more diligent and concerned in our own homes. And I close quote. So, if daily consistent scripture study isn't as consistent as you would like it to be, I invite you to make it consistent. Better a steady stream than alternating droughts and floods. Now, there's so much more that can be said of early Mesopotamia, especially about Sumer. They were the ones, after all, who created the world's earliest system of writing. Cuneiform, a term we have given their characters that literally means wedge-formed, and in those writings, they recorded the earliest principles of math as well. Their 60-base number system, as opposed to our 10-base count system where we start reusing numbers after 9, provides the basis for how we keep track of time. 60 seconds to a minute, 60 minutes to an hour. They also developed the first calendar, the first wheel, proving not for the last time in history that you don't have to be placed in an ideal environment to make a mark on the world. But despite their achievements, these separate cities were constantly in rivalry with each other, often going to war. These squabbles came to an end, however, with the introduction of the first emperor in recorded history, King Sargon. So, no one is quite sure when exactly this guy was born, but I'm going to go with tradition and pin his emergence into the world scene at around 2300 BC. Sargon of Acadia, a region in the northeasternish part of the Fertile Crescent, was the first to conquer and unite much of Mesopotamia, or any other similarly large swath of earth in recorded history. We know he existed given the statues and tablets and reliefs left behind depicting this ruler, but one of the only records of his life is a cuneiform text called the Legend of Sargon. And because there are very few corroborating texts, that is, kind of no corroborating texts, we can't tell how much of this record is true or isn't true. Complicating this further is that it claims to be an autobiography, but it was created some 200 years after his death. So, yeah. Given those limitations, It does, however, give us some insight into who he was. So Sargon's account tells of a boy who was abandoned at birth and thrown into a basket and left in a river, where he was found by a gardener. And if that sounds familiar, good on you. Sargon does predate Moses, so maybe this legend inspires Moses' mother to do the same. In any case, this is your reminder that leaving infants in baskets is no longer socially acceptable. What a pity, though. Sargon got left in a basket, and he became the world's first emperor. Moses got left in a basket and became a prophet. But somehow I don't think my wife would very much appreciate me leaving our youngest son Louis floating in the nearby river. Especially this wintry time of year. Anyway, I digress. This record blushingly accounts how from such humble beginnings, Sargon was able to climb the ladder of power and eventually become king. And not just king to his city, but after a glorious conquest, the king of much of the then-known world. Now, again, we can be skeptical of the authenticity of this record, but what we can say is this. It was recorded this way for a reason. Even as an emperor, a wise ruler will always feel a need to have those he leads to at least feel like that their leader is one of them. And using a rags to riches story to accomplish that, it's a good solid way to do that. How good or bad a ruler he was, however, is unknown. His empire did not survive long after his death, so however good or bad people had it during his reign, it all came crashing down afterwards. Near the end of his rule, a number of sources tell us that rebellions were increasingly frequent. And because Sargon was the only real government figure with any significant authority in his empire, he ended up likely being like butter spread too thinly over bread, unable to manage the diverse peoples and needs he had tried to govern. And here's where I see yet another connection with the story of Moses. Take Exodus chapter 18. Moses is also feeling the burden of leadership in this chapter, as anyone in all of the tribes of Israel who has something to complain about, for example, neighbor stole my goat, wife got run over by that man's ox, that man's camel spat in my kid's eye. Literally, anyone who wants to see the manager, they have to go to Moses. And so you can imagine the kind of lines that would have. Fortunately, Jethro, his father-in-law, points out that he is going to wear himself away unless he gets people to help him out. Delegation of responsibility is a huge deal. It's a key feature of any successful government, especially so in the church. Which, I should point out, at least in my area, we have been asked to do what we can to help our bishops. There is much that bishops have traditionally done that they technically don't need to do. The Elders Quorum or Relief Society president, for example, can assist with providing counseling in some situations. Other ward members with specialities in finance or employment assistance can supply help for those needing assistance with those matters, again, where the situation allows it. Especially since the recent change where the bishopric has been given a direct responsibility to not only lead the young men's priesthood quorums, but also keep that same close source of support for the young women. One of their key priorities, if not the top priority, should be the youth. And even if you're not a member who's maybe not as visible as the Elders Quorum president or Relief Society president or others in leadership positions, your consistent, faithful efforts to minister regularly to ministering families is vital. You are the bishop's eyes and ears for helping him be aware of the needs of those families. In Sargon's case, however, he unfortunately did not have Uncle Jethro, or actually that's a father-in-law Jethro, isn't it? Yeah, he didn't have a father-in-law Jethro or a church leadership handbook, and so his empire died with him. But the idea of a vast united domain did survive, and it influenced future leaders to cultivate similar ambitions. Of those, I'll focus next on an earlier ruler in Old Babylon by the name of Hammurabi. Hopefully, this guy's name is familiar to you, at least more easily so than Sargon's. Hammurabi did follow Sargon's example, establishing an empire over much of Mesopotamia, but he avoided Sargon's mistakes. He didn't keep all the power to himself. He smartly set up a bureaucracy under him. The ancestor of the system, a certain boy called Daniel, will be forcibly drafted to in the future. More on that later. Hammurabi did also wisely innovate, or may have had a subordinate innovate for him, a way to more uniformly govern the vast Babylonian Empire. And that is what we call today the Code of Hammurabi. Now, this wasn't the first time someone in Mesopotamia wrote down laws people should live by, but it is the most complete set of laws that has survived to the modern age from such an early period. These laws were prominently recorded in cuneiform on circular stone columns, placed in the middle of each city for people to refer to. Of course, not everyone can read, so how does this end up being beneficial? Well, first of all, some people in each city, notably the judges and government officers charged with following and enforcing those laws, can read and are taught to do so. Secondly, there is a nice little relief at the top of the code depicting Hammurabi receiving these laws as a sort of revelation from one of his gods. So even if you couldn't read, the meaning was pretty clear. These laws were meant to be the final word, and were seen as legitimate as can be for that culture. And the laws were quite clear, draconically so. Predating Moses' time when he wrote of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, King Hammurabi introduced this concept of tit-for-tat justice, or what we call lex talionis, the law of retaliation. And while critical precedents for future law, like the presumption of innocence and evidence-based convictions, usually, are featured here, it also highlights a continuing problem we will see with every system of law created by mortals ever since. Consider the following actual laws from the Code, number 196 through 199, if you want to look it up yourself, and you can see if you can spot the problem. So we'll begin with 196 here, which reads, "If a man put out the eye of a nobleman, his eye shall be put out." Okay, fair enough. Oh well, fair-ish enough, I guess. 197 here, though, is where it gets interesting. "If he puts out the eye of a freed man," that is kind of just your regular Joe, "or breaks the bone of a freed man, he shall pay 1 gold mina." Then Law 199. "If he puts out the eye of a man's slave, or breaks the bone of a man's slave, he shall pay 1/2 of its value." That is half of a gold mina. So, that's where we begin the unfortunately predictable practice of rule makers ensuring the rules best service themselves. The Code of Hammurabi is replete with discrimination according not just to socioeconomic status like we see here in this example, but also according to gender, unfortunately. So, for example, if a wife were accused of adultery, she gets tied up with the offending partner and thrown into a river. But if the husband even accuses her of adultery, the law states that she is to toss herself in, and I quote, "for her husband's sake." And in case you were wondering, no, there isn't a law that says women can accuse their husbands of adultery and have the same thing happen. These laws violate the first of 6 key principles of the rule of law as taught in BYU American Heritage courses, and that principle is generality. For a nation to be governed by the rule of law, its laws must apply equally to everyone, regardless of race, gender, religion, or other such background factors. In the Book of Mormon, when the Gadianton robbers took control of the Nephite government, we see an example of how this principle is violated in Helaman chapter 7, verse 5, as the corrupt judges then condemned the righteous because of their righteousness, let the guilty and the wicked go unpunished because of their money, and moreover, to be held in office at the head of government, to rule and do according to their wills, that they might get gain and glory of the world, and moreover, that they might the more easily commit adultery and steal and kill and do according to their own wills. And since I mentioned the principles of the rule of law, some of you may be curious as to what the others are. The same BYU course teaches that these others are also important for the rule of law. The second of them being prospectivity, or the principle that laws can only apply to future behaviors and not past ones before the law was written. That gets into ex post facto for you lawyers out there. Publicity is the next principle. That's the idea that laws need to generally be available to the public so we have a chance to see what they are and be familiar with them so that we know what we need to do. Consent is the next one. The governed should have some sort of say in the creation of the law. That idea of no taxation without representation from the American Revolutionary War, that's all based on this idea of consent. Due process is the next key principle of the rule of law. You can't just accuse and sentence someone. Guilt must be firmly established before the law can punish anyone. And then finally, this last principle, specificity. The laws should be clear and not vague. Hard to understand rules, after all, are hard to follow rules. So, as measured according to this particular yardstick of these principles of the rule of law, the Code of Hammurabi had some definite success, but some drawbacks. They did provide some of the first limitations, however few they may have been anyway, on what kings could or could not do. And in that, at least, the code was a definite step forward. So, unfortunately, we're a little bit past our 20-minute mark that I like to have for these episodes. So we will kind of cut off our discussion there. Thank you, though, for joining us. We will be back next week, Friday, as we discuss another major ancient civilization, one that ultimately got deeply interconnected with Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt. So, also, if you have enjoyed this podcast, be sure to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And if you know others who would enjoy this series, please consider sharing it with them. I would like to thank everyone who has supported the launch of this podcast, including my lovely wife, my kids, and my loving brother-in-law, Spencer, for suggesting I go through with this idea. And again, thank you for listening, and stay safe out there.